Parallel hearts. The universe keeps secrets in its folds. Between the fabric of space and the whispers of time, there exist moments, rare, impossible moments, when two worlds brush against each other like lovers' fingertips across a crowded room. This is what happened every century between Earth and Kael'thar, a planet orbiting a dying star 17 light-years away. For exactly 24 hours, their realities would overlap. Physics couldn't explain it. Scientists on both worlds had tried. Some called it a cosmic anomaly, others a gift. But for two souls, it became everything. First convergence, 1824. The meadow appeared without warning. Elena Vasquez stood in her family's wheat field outside Seville when the air fractured. Not violently, more like watching watercolors bleed into each other. The golden Spanish countryside remained, but now something else existed within it. Purple grass, knee-high and luminescent, sprouted between the wheat stalks. The sky held two suns, one familiar and warm, the other distant and violet. She should have run. Any sensible person would have. But Elena had spent 23 years in a world that demanded she be sensible, practical, marriageable. She stepped forward instead. That's when she saw him. He knelt by a crystalline stream that hadn't existed moments before, his hands cupped around something glowing. His skin carried an iridescence, like oil on water, shifting between silver and deep blue. 4 fingers on each hand, long and elegant. When he sensed her presence and looked up, his eyes, 3 of them, forming a triangle on his face, widened. They stared at each other across the impossible overlap of their worlds. "You're real," Elena whispered in Spanish, then repeated in broken Latin, the only other language she knew. He stood slowly, tilting his head. When he spoke, the sounds meant nothing to her, musical and layered like multiple instruments playing at once. But his expression, wonder mixed with disbelief, needed no translation. They spent the first hour in careful circles, maintaining distance. He would gesture to his world, she would gesture to hers. The stream from his reality flowed through her wheat field. A massive tree from Kael'thar grew through her father's barn, its branches heavy with fruit that glowed like small moons. By the second hour, they sat together on the purple grass. Elena sketched in the dirt with a stick. The sun, the earth, herself. He understood. He drew 2 suns. His planet, himself. She pointed to her chest and said, "Elena." He touched his own chest, and the sound he made was complex, layered, like multiple instruments playing at once. But he saw her struggle and simplified it. Theron. Theron. She repeated it until she got the pronunciation right, and when she did, he smiled. His smile was different from any human expression. It involved a slight luminescence along his cheekbones, a soft glow, but she understood it completely. By the 6th hour, they had developed a language of gestures and drawings. He showed her how the fruit from his tree tasted, sweet and electric, making her tongue tingle. She shared bread from her pocket and watched his 3 eyes widen at the simple miracle of wheat and yeast. By the 12th hour, they lay side by side, watching clouds from both worlds drift through each other. She had never felt so known by another being. Every gesture he made seemed to answer questions she hadn't known how to ask. When she laughed, that luminescence on his face brightened. When he made a sound she learned was laughter, her heart felt too large for her chest. By the 18th hour, the reality of impermanence crashed over them. The edges where their worlds met had begun to soften, pulling apart like tired seams. Thrawn stood, agitated, speaking rapidly in his language. She didn't need to understand the words. The desperation in his voice told her everything. Elena grabbed his hand, so different from hers, yet fitting perfectly between her fingers. "Will it happen again?" she asked, knowing he couldn't understand, but needing to ask anyway. He seemed to grasp her meaning. He held up fingers, attempting to communicate something about time, about cycles. Then he pressed his palm flat against her chest, right over her heart. She did the same to him. His heartbeat was faster than hers, a hummingbird flutter against her palm. In the final hour, they stopped trying to communicate. They simply held each other as their worlds pulled apart. Elena memorized everything. The way his skin felt like warm silk, how he smelled of ozone and something sweet she couldn't name, the vibration of his voice against her shoulder as he spoke softly in his language. When the convergence ended, it happened gradually, then all at once. The purple grass faded. The violet sound dimmed. The crystalline stream evaporated into morning mist. Elena's hand in his became translucent, then empty air. Elena stood alone in her father's wheat field, the early morning sun warm on her face. For a moment, she convinced herself it had been a dream. Then she saw the imprint in the grass where they'd sat. A single piece of glowing fruit lay in the dirt, already dimming, but unmistakably real. She picked it up, held it to her chest, and wept. The Waiting, 1824 to 1924. Elena never married. She told her family she was called to a different life, and in a way, that was true. She became a teacher, filled her small house with books and star charts. Every night she looked up and tried to find Kael'thar among the infinite lights, though she knew it was impossible with the naked eye. She kept a journal, documenting everything she could remember: the way Theron moved, the sound of his laughter, the exact shade of purple in that grass. On nights when loneliness threatened to hollow her out completely, she would reread these entries and remember, it had been real. She died at 91, 3 years before the next convergence, her journal clutched to her chest. On Kael'thar, Theron did marry. It was expected of his caste. He fathered children, contributed to his society's artistic movements, and became a respected philosopher. But a part of him remained in that wheat field on an alien world, holding hands with the woman who had 3 fewer fingers than he did and eyes that were only 2 but held entire universes. He created a monument where he'd knelt by the stream, a simple stone carved with Elena's name in Earth's letters, learned from those precious 24 hours of studying her writing. He visited it every day of his long life. He lived to be 203, dying 17 years before the next convergence, still wondering if she had waited, if she had remembered, if love could transcend the walls between realities. Second convergence, 1924. The convergence returned to the same geographic coordinates: Earth's Spain, Kael'thar's Felvana province. The wheat field had become a town. Buildings stood where Elena and Theron had lain in the grass, but the universe doesn't care about human architecture. The purple grass erupted through cobblestones. The great tree burst through a cafe wall. Marco Rodriguez, 25, studying engineering at the University of Madrid, had come home to visit his grandmother. He was walking through the town square when reality fractured, and he found himself standing knee-deep in bioluminescent vegetation. Across the convergence, in the exact spot where Theron had built his monument, stood Lysa. She was kneeling at the stone marker, tracing her ancestor's name with 4 delicate fingers: Theron. She looked up and saw Marco. Her 3 eyes met his 2. They both felt it, a recognition that made no sense, a pull neither could explain. It was as if their DNA carried the memory of this moment, of this connection their ancestors had forged a century before. Lysa spoke first, and though Marco didn't understand the melodic layers of her language, he heard his great-great-grandmother's name. Elena? His breath caught. You know that name? She stood, moving toward him with a grace that seemed to bend physics. From a pouch at her side, she retrieved something impossible: a journal, ancient and worn, its pages filled with his ancestors' handwriting. Beside it, another book, in the flowing script of Kelthar. Theron, she said, touching the second journal. Elena, she touched the first. They had both been sent by their families, carrying the journals of ancestors who had spoken of an impossible love, a day when worlds touched. Marco's grandmother had made him promise to visit the old wheat field, though she died before explaining why. Lysa's grandmother had done the same. The universe, it seemed, was a romantic. But Lysa and Marco were products of different times than their ancestors. They had science, context, awareness of the convergence's mechanics. They knew this would end. They knew they had 24 hours. They spent the first hours sharing the journals, using translation devices they'd brought, technology their ancestors couldn't have dreamed of. Marco read Theron's words, how he'd loved Elena with a completeness that defied their differences. Lysa read Elena's entries, her longing across the decades, her certainty that love wasn't limited by biology or reality. They never saw each other again, Lysa said in her language, her device translating to Spanish in Marco's earpiece. No, Marco confirmed. Both died before the next convergence. They sat in silence processing the tragedy. Then Marco laughed, surprising himself. They got one day and it defined their entire lives. That's either the most beautiful thing I've ever heard or the saddest. Perhaps both, Lysa said, her luminescence shifting, patterns moving across her skin like thoughts made visible. They chose to let one day matter more than a lifetime of safer choices. Marco looked at her, truly looked. She was alien in every measurable way. Her physiology, her world, her very existence contradicted his reality. Yet, sitting beside her, reading these journals, he felt an intimacy he'd never experienced with anyone from his own species. 24 hours, he said quietly. 23 now, she corrected, checking a device on her wrist that measured the convergence's stability. They made a decision then, perhaps the same one Elena and Theron had made. They would not waste their time mourning what they couldn't have. They would celebrate what they could. Lysa taught Marco to see in the ultraviolet spectrum using a device from her world. Suddenly, both realities bloomed with colors he'd never imagined. He showed her music from Earth, jazz which had reached Spain from America. She moved to it, her body creating patterns that were dance and light show combined. They talked about everything: philosophy, art, the weight of being descended from people who'd loved impossibly. Marco confessed he'd never felt he belonged anywhere. Lysa admitted she'd always sensed something missing, a piece of herself existing in an unreachable place. As the convergence's final hours approached, they returned to Theron's monument. Marco pulled out a chisel he'd brought and carved below Theron's name, Marco. Lysa added her name in her language's beautiful, flowing script. "A century from now," Marco began, "someone will stand here," Lysa finished, "from your line and mine." They held each other as their worlds separated. Unlike their ancestors, they had pictures, videos, recordings. Unlike their ancestors, they had contact information, though messages would take 17 years traveling at light speed, arriving long after context had faded. But like their ancestors, they had something more important, proof that connection wasn't limited by the possible. When the convergence ended, Marco stood in a ruined town square, trying to explain to bewildered officials why buildings had been damaged and strange vegetation was already withering in the Spanish sun. Lysa returned to her life on Kael'thar, carrying a jazz recording and photographs of a man with only 2 eyes who had somehow seen straight into her soul. They both lived full lives. Marco became an astrophysicist, dedicating his career to understanding convergence phenomena. Lysa became an ambassador for inter-reality cultural studies, a new field inspired by the journals. Neither married, both looked up at night, toward stars they knew held the other, impossibly far and infinitely close. Third Convergence, 2024. By the time the third convergence arrived, both worlds had changed dramatically. The Spanish town had become a protected site, a museum dedicated to the convergence phenomenon. Scientists from around the globe gathered every century, instruments ready, hoping to understand the impossible. On Kael'thar, the monument site had become a pilgrimage destination, a symbol of cross-reality connection that had inspired generations of artists, philosophers, and dreamers. Dr. Sarah Rodriguez Chen, 47, stood in the museum wearing a sensor-covered suit that would record every moment of the convergence. She was Marco's great-granddaughter, a quantum physicist who'd spent her career studying the theoretical frameworks that might explain this phenomenon. She was also dying, a degenerative neural condition untreatable by Earth's medicine, giving her perhaps 5 more years. She decided to spend one of those years here, waiting for the convergence. Not for romance, she'd never been particularly interested in that, but for understanding. She needed to know why this happened, what it meant. The convergence began differently this time. Both worlds had technology monitoring the event, and the readings were troubling. The overlap was less stable, fluctuating. Scientists shouted warnings. The convergence might collapse early, might not complete, might be the last. Reality split open, and Sarah found herself in a landscape transformed. The monument was now a towering structure, covered in names. Generations of names from both worlds, carved by descendants who'd come to honor that first impossible meeting. Standing before it was Kelth, 33 by Earth's reckoning, though his species aged differently. He wore a breathing apparatus, necessary, as Kael'thar's atmosphere had grown toxic over the past century, their sun's decay accelerating. His people were slowly evacuating, preparing for their world's end. He was a physician, specializing in neurology. He carried medical scanning equipment, hoping to study human biology during the convergence, to understand differences that might help save lives on both worlds. They approached each other warily, professionally. This wasn't the romantic meeting of their ancestors. This was scientific, important. They both had jobs to do. Dr. Rodriguez Chen? Kelth asked through a translator, his 3 eyes scanning her sensor readings. You can call me Sarah. And you're Dr. Kael'thar Theron? Just Kelth, please. He paused. Our ancestors. Were Elena and Theron. Yes, and Marco and Lysa. Sarah gestured at the monument. Quite the family legacy to live up to. Indeed. I admit I felt pressure to fall madly in love within minutes of meeting you, Kelth said, and his luminescence shifted in what she was learning to recognize as humor. Sarah laughed genuinely. Same. Bit of a disappointment for the romantics, I suppose. We're far too practical for that nonsense. They began their work, scanning each other with instruments, sharing data in real time with their respective worlds. But as hours passed, something unexpected happened. Not love at first sight, they were both too old, too scarred by life for that particular delusion. Instead, they talked. Sarah told him about her diagnosis, the frustration of an intelligent mind trapped in a deteriorating body. Kelth shared about his world's slow death, the grief of watching a civilization gradually abandon their home planet. We're both running out of time, Sarah said, sitting on purple grass that grew through the museum's foundation. Yes, though perhaps that makes the time we have more valuable. Kelth's scanning device beeped. He looked at the readings, his luminescence shifting through colors Sarah didn't have names for. Your neural pathways. May I scan more deeply? She consented. As his instruments played over her skull, he explained what he was seeing. The degeneration wasn't what Earth's doctors thought. The pattern was different, and Kael'tharian medicine, developed over millennia dealing with radiation-induced mutations from their dying sun, might have treatments. You're saying you can help me? Sarah's voice cracked despite her scientist's composure. I'm saying it's possible. If... He trailed off, consulting his device. If our worlds maintain contact, if the convergence continues, if we can transmit the full medical data before we separate. They worked frantically then, racing against time in a different way than their ancestors had. Kelth transmitted 17 years' worth of medical research to Sarah's computers. She sent him everything Earth knew about atmospheric reclamation, hoping it might buy his people more time. In the final hours, exhausted, they sat together at the monument. "We didn't fall in love," Sarah said. "No," Kelth agreed. "We did something different. We saved each other." They carved their names on the monument not as lovers, but as something equally profound. Witnesses to each other's existence, proof that connection across the void could take infinite forms. When the convergence ended, Sarah had data that would lead to her treatment. She lived another 43 years, healthy and brilliant, pushing the boundaries of quantum physics until the day she died peacefully in her sleep. Kelth brought atmospheric restoration techniques to his world. It wasn't enough to save Kael'thar forever, but it bought them centuries instead of decades. Time for a graceful evacuation, for culture to be preserved, for no one to be left behind. They never met again, but they exchanged messages across the 17-year communication gap. Slow conversations, questions asked in middle age and answered in old age, but conversations nonetheless. Proof that love wasn't the only force that could bridge realities. Fourth convergence, 2124. The last convergence arrived when both worlds barely remembered the first. Earth's Spain had risen and fallen. The land where Elena's wheat field once stood was now underwater, climate change having redrawn coastlines. But the universe didn't care about oceans. The convergence point emerged on a floating research platform built above the flooded site. Kael'thar was nearly empty. Most of its people had evacuated to colony worlds, but a small group remained, caretakers and historians, determined to witness their planet's final decades. Yuki Torres Rodriguez, 78, stood on the platform in a flotation suit. She was Elena's descendant through 6 generations, though the bloodline had wandered across continents, mixing with Japanese, Nigerian, and Brazilian families. She'd spent her life as a poet, largely dismissive of her family's obsession with the convergence stories, until her great-grandmother Sarah's journals surfaced after her death, along with medical data that revealed something stunning. The treatment that had saved Sarah had altered her genetic code in subtle ways, changes that passed to her descendants. Yuki carried DNA from both worlds now, a living bridge between realities. She'd come to the convergence point out of curiosity more than belief. She'd lived a full life, loved, lost, created art, raised children who now had children. She expected to observe, document, perhaps write one final poem. The convergence tore open, violent and unstable. Alarms screamed on the platform. Scientists shouted about cascade failures, about this being the final event, about gravitational anomalies that suggested the phenomenon was burning itself out. Through the fractured reality, Yuki saw Kael'thar's dying sun, bloated and red, consuming its planet's sky. The purple grass was brown and withered. The great tree had fallen. And standing in the ruins was someone who made Yuki's breath catch. Ren var Kelth var Theron, 112 by human reckoning, ancient by his species' standards. He'd been born on a colony world, but insisted on returning to Kael'thar for this final convergence. He leaned on a walking apparatus, his iridescent skin faded with age, but his 3 eyes were still bright. He saw her and smiled, luminescence flickering weakly on his weathered face. They moved toward each other slowly, old bones and tired muscles carrying them through the impossible overlap. Scientists on both sides screamed at them to stop. The convergence was unstable. They could be hurt, killed. They ignored everyone. When they met in the center, where purple grass and salt water mixed impossibly, Ren reached out with 4 gnarled fingers. Yuki took his hand with her 5. "Hello," she said in Earth's common language. "Hello," he replied in the same, accent thick but understandable. They didn't have 24 hours. The convergence was collapsing. Readings suggested they had minutes, perhaps less. "I know you," Ren said, searching her face. "From the stories, from the genes. We carry them all inside us, don't we? Every meeting before this one. Yuki felt tears on her weathered cheeks. Elena and Theron, Marco and Lysa, Sarah and Kelth, yes, I feel them too. This is the end, Ren said, not sadly, just stating fact. My world is dying. The convergence is failing. We won't meet again. No, I agreed. We won't. They stood together as both their worlds screamed warnings. The platform beneath them shuddered. The ground on Kael'thar cracked. Reality itself seemed to be sobbing at the separation. Was it worth it? All of it? The waiting, the longing, the impossible love story repeated across centuries? Yuki looked at this being who was utterly alien and completely familiar. She thought of Elena dying clutching a journal, of Marco dedicating his life to understanding, of Sarah pushing the boundaries of what was possible, of all the descendants on both worlds who'd carried this story forward. Yes, she said, firmly, because we were seen, because we mattered to each other across the impossible, because love, in all its forms, refused to accept boundaries. The convergence collapsed. But unlike the previous times, unlike the slow fade of worlds pulling apart, this ending was violent. Reality snapped like an overstretched rubber band. Yuki felt herself being pulled apart, her existence fracturing. And then something impossible happened. The mixed DNA in her cells, the genetic bridge between worlds that Sarah's treatment had created, reacted to the convergence collapse. For just an instant, a fraction of a second that lasted forever, she existed in both places at once. Truly. Not overlapping, but simultaneous. She saw everything. Earth in all its water-covered glory, Kael'thar in its dying beauty, the 16 light-years between them, the quantum foam where realities touched, the mathematics of love written in the stars themselves. And in that infinite moment, she saw them all, Elena and Theron forever in their meadow, Marco and Lysa dancing to jazz under two suns, Sarah and Kelth saving each other with science and compassion, all of them existing in the space between, in the moment where connection transcended physics. Ren saw it too. Their hands, still clasped, became a conduit. For one eternal second, every descendant from both worlds felt it, a surge of recognition, of belonging, of understanding that they were all part of something larger than themselves. Then reality snapped back, and Yuki was alone on the platform, the ocean calm, the sky holding only one sun. But she wasn't empty. None of them were. Every descendant on both worlds felt it, a warmth in their chests, a knowing they couldn't explain. They'd been touched by something beyond understanding, a love that had transcended death, time, space, and reality itself. Epilogue. Yuki lived 5 more years. She spent them writing, not poetry this time, but a simple narrative, the truth of what happened between two worlds. The book was published on Earth 3 weeks after her death. Through the slow ships carrying messages between human space and Kael'tharian colonies, it eventually reached Ren's descendants. Both civilizations made it required reading, not because it was great literature, Yuki would have laughed at that notion, but because it answered a question both species had been asking since they developed consciousness. Are we alone? The answer, it turned out, was no. Even across the void, even across impossible distances and incompatible biologies, we reach for each other. We find ways to matter to each other. The convergence never returned. Kael'thar's sun went supernova 18 years after that final meeting, sterilizing the planet. Earth continued its slow dance with climate change, adaptation, and survival. But both worlds carried forward a story that once, In defiance of every law of physics and probability, two realities touched, and in those brief moments across 4 centuries, two civilizations learned that loneliness wasn't inevitable, that connection was always possible, that love, in all its infinite variations, was the closest thing to a universal language. On a colony world 30 light-years from Earth, in a garden grown to remember Kael'thar, someone planted purple grass from preserved seeds. It grew bioluminescent and impossible next to earth wheat. They grew together, roots intertwining beneath the soil, reaching toward each other in the darkness, just like everything else in the universe that ever dared to love.